One little perk from traveling so much were the accumulation of airline mileage points. And so after accumulating 10,000 miles or whatever the number was, tickets were available to travel, well, just about anywhere in the world. And so in 1987, I'd accumulated enough for Shirley and I to go to Europe. And so we decided to go to France and take a grand tour of that country. We flew to Paris and rented a car, as you see in this picture. And we didn't make any reservations ahead of time. We just traveled each day. I knew when we had to be back to catch our flight back home, but that was the only fixed point. So each day we traveled until we decided to quit, and then maybe at 3 in the afternoon or so, if we were going through a city or a village, we'd start watching the second floors of the buildings for a sign that would be advertising a hotel, because most of the hotels were small, and the lower floor, the ground floor, was a bar room or a restaurant, and the rental rooms were then on the floors above that. So we did that the whole trip. In fact, we always did that. Every trip we took, we never made reservations ahead of time. We always found interesting places. Most of the hotels that we stayed in were relatively inexpensive too. We paid, I would say, an average of $40 a night. The hotels were usually owned by the people who ran the place. The wife was usually the cook, and the husband ran the bar and took care of the other details that were necessary for the operation of the hotel. But in almost every case that I can recall, I remember one place we went into, this owner was very friendly and so forth, and when he found out we were from Michigan, he invited us down to the bar room for a glass of wine after we got settled in our room. So Shirley and I went down, and there were a number of locals there, and we got to talking. Fortunately, I could speak passable French anyway, and when they found out we were from Michigan, they started saying, "Oh, Michigan, Michigan, you know." We know Michigan. It was fun. People are always friendly and gracious and willing to help if we needed it or whatever. So the room came with breakfast, a continental breakfast, which always consisted of various sweet rolls and jam and butter and coffee and maybe a fruit. Not as frequently, but certainly the homemade bakery stuff was always sufficient and good. We drove to Chartres, southwest of Paris, about 40 miles or so. This is a beautiful cathedral constructed around 1200 AD, and the vertical walls are almost all glass, and the sunlight passing through this beautiful stained glass, original for the most part, depicting saints and other holy and sacred events, is a sight to behold. It's incredible, and it's world known. The floor has a huge maze embedded in the marble and represents our path through life. After we'd seen the cathedral, we decided to drive on down to Bordeaux and stay overnight there. And as this picture shows, my car is parked on the sidewalk across the street from the hotel. When we arrived there that evening, I couldn't find a parking place anywhere. There were cars everywhere on the sidewalk. Ahead and behind me, I just found this gap between two cars there on the sidewalk, so I just left it there. And the next morning when I looked out the hotel window, I was surprised to see that mine was the only one still parked on the sidewalk, and I was a little surprised that there wasn't a ticket or something on the windshield, but there wasn't, and everything worked out fine. We had breakfast there, and then we drove on down to Tours, the famous city where St. Martin lived, and of course it's famous for many other historical events too, but we didn't stay there, we just passed through, and we drove on to Lourdes. For some reason the crowds were very thin when we arrived there, and so we had no trouble finding a room in the hotel, and we spent the rest of that day and then the following day walking around and taking in the sight of so many miracles and the miraculous appearance of the Blessed Virgin, in which she proclaimed the Immaculate Conception and healed so many people from the waters that sprang from the spring that St. Bernadette was told to dig for. And that was around 1850, as I recall, and the spring is still flowing, and miracles still happen there. It's all well documented, and I'd highly recommend your reading about it if you haven't become familiar with this famous shrine of our Blessed Mother. We left there and went to south to the Pyrenees and Andorra, and it was a 17-mile twisting road up to the top of that place. Well, during our travels in France, we'd stop at lunchtime and go into a grocery store and buy a variety of cheeses that France is famous for, and of course buy some bread and some fruit or whatever, and we'd stop out in the countryside and have a nice lunch and enjoy the peace and quiet of rural France. And we were paying, I would say, American prices at that type of level pricing, which wasn't outrageous. I'm not complaining. When we drove up there, it's a small place, only had 180 square miles of territory. Of course, skiing and so forth provides a large part of their income, but the traffic from France up there was amazing. I didn't understand what the attraction was until I got there and went into a store. And they didn't have any taxes there, and the prices were incredibly low for the same product 17 miles away. There weren't very many stores, there were just a couple or three, as I recall. One thing that was kind of interesting, on the back wall of the store, and this wasn't a huge store by any means, but along the back wall were a row of wine kegs on a rack, and the paper cups were there, or plastic cups, and for a dime you could get a cup full of wine of any of the selection. I guess you could have cheated and used the same cup, but for the amount of money it cost, it was hardly worth endangering your soul for a cup of wine. But and the wine was decent enough. I mean, for somebody that doesn't know the difference, it was fine. We drove along the top of the mountain range from Andorra to the coast, Balearic Sea, still remaining in France. We didn't cross into Spain because I didn't have any paperwork or visa for Spain. But anyway, we drove in north around the bay, around Montpellier and into Marseille. As we were driving along, Shirley was reading some travel brochures about the region, and she mentioned this Roman aqueduct north of Nimes. It was used to convey water from springs up in the mountains to Nimes, a total of about 31 miles. It's interesting that the Romans didn't have optical devices in order to control their dimensioning of land and the slope and so forth, but they did use the instruments that they had devised, which were pretty accurate. In fact, parts of that aqueduct only slope 1 foot in 18,000 feet, and the sections there that only slope 1/4 of an inch in 800 feet. So they had very precise ways of measuring and performing that kind of accuracy. The slope was calculated so that the bridge could be held at a minimum amount of height from the river, but yet maintain enough heights to provide the gravity necessary to make the water flow the other 17 or 18 miles to Nimes at the distribution point. So it had to be very carefully constructed. Otherwise, if they hadn't maintained enough slope to assure gravity, they'd ended up with a big puddle somewhere in the middle of somewhere along the route. This bridge is masonry cut on site. I walked back the aqueduct about a half a mile or so, maybe a little more than that, to the quarry. You can still see the stone marks of the people who chiseled away the rocks there and freed them and cut them to size at the quarry and then hauled them to the site and erected them. They numbered the rocks in the quarry as to the position that they were supposed to go when they were finally in place. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing that they could cut them that accurately, and they did. I have a picture showing underneath one of the arches there the tightness of the joint. I couldn't get a credit card in between stones that were cut, and there was no mortar used. These are all friction fitted and precisely fitted. And you can see from this picture, it's radius toward the west. There's a strong wind blowing down this valley most of the time, and it's thought that the Romans arced that bridge against the wind so that the pressure of the wind would tighten the construction and it would resist it better. It's resisted severe earthquakes and major floods throughout the centuries. It was in use for about 900 years. Wars and other events caused the maintenance to stop. Dirt and weeds and vegetation started to grow and eventually clogged up. But it's incredible that it lasted that long. The trough was about 4 feet wide and 6 feet high. The lining of that trough originally was a combination of unripened fig juice and oxen blood, and they made sort of a latex paint out of this combination of stuff and painted the water-bearing surface of the aqueduct with this rubber latex kind of paint. Over the centuries, the highly mineralized water coming from the springs coated a layer of calcium carbonate on the inside of the aqueduct to a depth of about 8 or 10 inches. In the past few years, they've chipped off some of that carbonate deposits and found this paint still intact on the wall underneath all this deposit. Whatever this formula was, it worked. But there were leaks in the aqueduct itself. As the aqueduct traversed across the countryside, valleys and low points were bridged over with masonry arches, and all the way from the ground up, some places 8-10 feet high, where water dripped over the centuries and deposited the minerals underneath there. Pretty interesting. I hope I made that understandable. After we left the bridge, we drove down along the coast of the Mediterranean to the famous beaches at the Riviera. These beaches have a reputation of nude bathing, and so naturally we wanted to see all the natives and the sights that were to be seen. So we walked down along the beach, and it was a terrible beach. It was nothing but pebbles, and I didn't see any sand at all. It was really rough. And there weren't a lot of people on the beach, and it was a nice day, but I think that the spectacle that we saw there kind of drained enthusiasm. We did see some nudes, specifically 2 women in their late 60s, 70s, maybe even 80. They were old anyway, and their bodies had long since dissipated from their youth. But anyway, we stayed there overnight. But the next day then we left and drove up through Aosta. The next day we drove up into the mountains to Aosta, where I'd visited earlier in the first trip that I made to Italy in '73. But I wanted surely to see these spectacular mountains and deep gorges, incredible visions of ancient paths and so forth. I'll show you here in these photos. It's a famous place, and it was originally an outpost along the French-Spanish border, and they have a new rail tunnel through there. But our next visit was Ars, France. Pretty much north of Nimes and west of the Alps, more of the plains of central France. This village is famous for being the home of the Curé de Ars, or the priest of Ars, whose name was John Vianney. He wanted to be a priest as a young man, but he couldn't learn Latin. Maybe his aptitude or his intelligence wasn't adequate, whatever it was. He tried mightily a number of times, and the local bishop wanted him to be a priest, but he couldn't pass the exam, so it just didn't happen. He got inducted in the army and went AWOL. There was a lot of turmoil in France, a lot of revolutions and just general upheaval because the economic situation never did get resolved from the main revolution of 1792. And there was a lot of hate and resentment, a lot of religious wars. And so around 1850 or so, the shortage of priests was acute. So many had been killed and or deported or put on slave ships and imprisoned. There was a real shortage. The bishop decided to let John Vianney be an altarist, I believe is the right term. Anyway, he was given the authority to hear confessions and give absolution and say mass, but he couldn't preach and I don't remember what all the restrictions were, but I had part of the charisms of a priest. And he was assigned then to Ars, some distance from where he was born and raised. There are so many anecdotes of his ministry there at Ars. I'm going to repeat a couple of them, but one story goes that as he was approaching Ars on his first visit there, and at that time Ars was a very small village, maybe 12 or 15 houses. Today it's a small village, but it's considerably larger than that. As he was approaching, apparently he had an ox cart, and as a ox cart came in sight of the village, the oxen stopped dead, and he couldn't make it move. So he got out and he tried to lead it and so forth, but no matter what he did, he couldn't make the oxen move. So he disconnected the cart. He thought maybe the cart was, wheels were locked or something. But he couldn't move the cart either. The cart just seemed to be stuck on the ground and weighing thousands of tons. He began to pray and realized that there was a demon trying to stop him from entering Ars. And when he prayed, all of a sudden the demon was driven away, and the oxen and the cart were able to move and go into the village. Ars had been known as a very evil village, apparently. A lot of criminality and sexual things that weren't supposed to be done and so forth. But anyway, he got there, and most of the villagers didn't want any part of him. They didn't want him there, and they didn't want to stop their evil activity. But he persisted, and it was obvious he'd been given a gift for hearing confessions. People would go to confession there, and he would remind them when they didn't tell all their sins. He would remind them what they hadn't told him. And if they didn't want to do it, he just told them to leave and come back when they were ready to receive absolution. And he had a couple of healings, physical healings, occur during prayers that he had had over people. So his reputation began to spread, and over a period of time, 5 or 7 years maybe, whatever, it spread all over France. And people would come there in their wagons and horses and ox carts and stuff, and it started to block the highway, and it got to be a real serious problem. So they even built a spur. Anyway, he began to hold confessions from morning till midnight, around 16 or 18 hours a day, every day. And people would be standing in line and waiting to come in for 2 or 3 days. It was a real burden for him, to say the least. But worse than that, after he was hearing confessions, go home to his little hut nearby there, and the devil would be waiting for him. More than a few reports were made by the residents of hearing noises and crashing of furniture and struggles and strange noise during these tussles that he had with the devil. Periodically he ended up bruised. He was a skinny little guy. He wasn't very tall and emaciated. His food every week was boiled potatoes. On Sundays he'd boil enough potatoes to last a week. He certainly wasn't being nourished very well. In any case, his story has always been an interest to me, and I remember years ago, first read about him, and one of the anecdotes is this. At the end of the day, midnight or 1 o'clock, he decided he had to quit for the day. He started out the church, and on the front of the church, there on the steps, was a woman waiting to come in. And he turned to her and he said, "Your husband is safe." And she said, "Well, what do you know about my husband?" She was obviously from a village some distance away. He had not any knowledge of her prior to this time. He said, "Just before your husband hit the rocks, he repented. Apparently, he committed suicide by jumping off of a bridge. But just before he hit the rocks, he repented his sins and he was saved from eternal fire of self-murder." There are many such anecdotes about the Corridors, and they're very interesting reading. The whole story has been very shortened here, and I'd recommend reading the total history of his life. From ours, we drove through some mountainous country. When we went to Chamonix, Shirley wanted to see the skiing sites there, and she's been always interested in sports, so this was right up her alley. As you can see from these pictures, we drove over some spectacular highways. At Nantua, for example, these bridges are way above the valley and spectacular. I understand now they completed a bridge a couple of years ago that's one of the longest suspension bridges in the world, and across one of those valleys down there. From Chamonix, we drove up to Dijon, then Rougy. On our way to Dijon, we made a little circuit around to the monastery of St. Bernard and spent a few hours there. He lived in the 1000 era, and he built a monastery at Rougy in the early 11th century. So there was a connection between Rougy and St. Bernard. But I won't talk about Rougy again because I thoroughly covered Rougy in the first couple of videos early in the beginning of this whole thing. From Rougy we went to Reims. Reims has been at the center of many, many battles and many famous events that happened there. Popes used to be coronated there. Kings of France and other countries were crowned there in the city, in the cathedral at Reims. During the French Revolution, the cathedral there was destroyed, and the front of it is shown in this one of these pictures. A replacement cathedral was built and used today, but nearby are many famous battles. We went over to Verdun. I'll just let these pictures speak for themselves. I didn't know my bride was this old, but I think they missed her remains when they cleaned up the place. This is a view of Verdun from Fort Douaumont. We have a terrible seesaw battle over the months that battle went on. We lost 55,000 men killed there before the end of the war on November 11th at 11 a.m. 1918. This is the site of the first major battle between United States and German forces. We won, but it was a terrible sacrifice. This shows soldiers that were in a trench, and a large shell went off nearby and buried them instantly. Ossuary there at Verdun that contains millions of bones that were gathered up from the battlefields. tell you not to stray from the paths that have been delineated, because the unexploded ordnance that's buried in the dirt there up to a depth of about 10 feet. There's one place, though, that we were driving through that I didn't take a picture of. One day Shirley and I were driving on this narrow back road through the country, and this huge marble tombstone had been erected right along the edge of the highway. So I stopped and read the inscription on it, and it was from the parents of a soldier who had apparently been vaporized at this spot by a large German shell. And no part had ever been found of him, but witnesses pointed out that location where he was vaporized. But so many were vaporized like that. Near in Belgium, near, not far from Verdun, is a huge monument. And if I remember correctly, I think there are 186,000 names engraved on there that disappeared and never could find any trace of them. So this tombstone was not unique by any means. But the countryside is dotted with cemeteries from all nationalities. The Germans used cast iron crosses to mark their graves. From these battlefields, we drove on down to Paris and went up on the Eiffel Tower and had lunch up there on the second floor there at the restaurant. I went on up to the top again. I've been up there before, but I decided to go back up to the extreme top and refresh my memory of the view from up there. As an aside, I was flying somewhere one time and there was a magazine. I was reading it, and an advertisement for a book, all the drawings, a copy of them obviously, of all the drawings for the Eiffel Tower. So I ordered and got the book, and I have it with me here. It's a work of art. It's a wonderful example of the beauty of the workmanship of the draftsmen that worked in those days. Every detail, every bolt, every washer, everything is detailed and all written originally, or drawn rather, in ink and standing up at their boards in those days too.
That's my little beast.
Eiffel was a very clever and brilliant man, and was able to calculate, based on the strength of the materials that they had in those days, which was not very good. He calculated the amount of deflection that the tower would experience at various elevations and under various wind conditions. It's very detailed, and it's fascinating. Photographs of the construction process. It only took under 2 years to put it all together at the site. When the Allies invaded Paris in July of 1944, there was a lot of sniper fire and rear action killings and so forth by the Germans and the underground. And this sign shows a scene of a battle and fatalities just across the street from the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Also, I've got some pictures here showing some of the hotels that we stayed in. As you can see, they're not pretentious, but they were very economically priced and very clean, and very interesting people that owned them. As I described before, in Italy, it's the same circumstances exist in France and probably other countries in Europe too, that small hotels are very user-friendly. April in Paris really is a beautiful time to be there. Paris is a beautiful city. It's an old city, and there aren't many high-rises or anything like that to block the views. Most buildings are maybe 3 or 4 stories high, and so it's retained its ancient look, although it's been built a number of times too. But while we were there, we visited the Louvre and Versailles, and walked through the streets, the Arc of Triumph, and it was an enjoyable time. The weather was beautiful, and we had a good time. I've been there a number of times, but being with Shirley, of course, was a special treat. When our time was up in Paris, I had an appointment in London to meet a toolmaker that was working on a tool for me. And so we flew to London then, and a man by the name of John Rouse and his wife met us at the airport. And the tool that he was working on was supposed to be ready for sampling. However, as it turns out, he was a little late. So they invited us to stay at their house. And we did. We had a good time there. We met their daughter and, of course, his wife. And we were their guests for 3 or 4 days until the mold was ready for sampling. So we got to be very friendly and communicated in the years subsequent to that. Shirley and Mrs. Rouse did. They were maybe a little younger than we were, but certainly a lot of fun to be with. He did send me a book on ornamental turning that was written in the 19th century by a man who developed a lathe to turn really unbelievable ornamental designs and so forth on a lathe. But I never went back there. His tooling wasn't what I liked, and of course he was late too. So the day we were scheduled to depart, we went to Heathrow and got on the airplane, but it had snowed the night before, and the wings were covered with snow. And of course the normal procedure is to de-ice the wings before the plane takes off. So we were all boarded and ready to go, and the de-icing machine came, and they began to de-ice the wings. But they ran out of fluid and before they were finished, so we couldn't take off. So as it turns out, they were having some labor problems, and they had to go down to England somewhere to get more fluid. And they were gone 2 or 3 hours before they came back. And by the time they loaded it in, we had lost maybe 4 hours or so. And of course, we'd missed our connection in New York by this time. But anyway, they filled the thing up and started to spray again, and the machine broke down. Oh, the pilot was beside himself. He came on the microphone and he said, "I don't know why anybody flies this stupid airline." It was British Airways. But anyway, we were stuck for 8 hours there on the tarmac waiting for a simple thing like de-icing before we were able to leave. And of course, they wouldn't let us off, so we were trapped. But such is life. Anyway, we got home safely. This incident with the British Airways reminds me of one I had in Paris. I was there at Thanksgiving time, and I went to I guess I went to De Gaulle Airport to catch my flight. And as I was standing in line, they stopped the line and said that my flight was on strike. The airlines had gone on strike and stopped every other flight. And of course, mine was one of the unfortunate ones. So it left me stranded there, and I really wanted to be home for the holiday, although it was already Thanksgiving Day. But in any case, I went, I don't remember the airline, well, it was Air France that went on strike. So I walked over to the American Airlines counter, and they told me that they didn't have a seat, but they'd be glad to put me on standby in case somebody didn't show up or whatever. So I accepted that situation, and I waited an hour or two, and they called me, and they said that they had a seat for me, and it flew to New York, though, and they couldn't do anything more for me after that. I'd have to make other arrangements in New York. So I flew to New York and went to the American Airlines counter there, and it was Thanksgiving Day, and it was a very crowded, busy place. I went up to the airlines counter, American Airlines counter, and they said, "Oh gosh, the chances of me getting a seat out of there that day was pretty slim," and but they put me on standby. So I waited there an hour or two, and they called me and they said they had a flight to Atlanta, and I could have a better opportunity of getting to Louisville from Atlanta than I did from New York. And they said they had one first class seat open, and I could have it if I wanted it. So I took it. Any case, I got to Atlanta, and of course, the old scenario repeated itself. I went to the American Airlines counter, and I was probably number 6 or 7 in the standby lot there. They drew them off the top of the pile, and my, of course, ticket went on the bottom. So I'm standing around waiting, trying to, hopeful to get on a plane to Louisville. And they kept calling people, and of course, the tickets, the pile gradually whittled down to mine. I was the last one. And they called somebody from, as it turns out, he was from Texas. And he came up to the counter, and he said that he had a partner with him, and they wanted to go together. And I remember this so clearly. The airline agent was really was worn out from all the turmoil and so forth, and he was standing there holding the ticket out toward this guy from Texas, and this guy from Texas was trying to persuade that clerk to give his partner a seat on the jump seat of the airplane, which of course the ticket agent wasn't about to do that. And he kept arguing. He got loud and nasty. He wasn't pleasant about it at all. And he reached out to get the ticket from the agent, and the agent just suddenly jerked it away from him and swung around, and I was standing right next to him. He swung around, he said, "Here, you take this ticket and get on there, run right now." So I grabbed that ticket and I ran and left the guy standing there. And I got to Louisville, and okay then. It was really pretty comical, the look on that guy's face when the clerk did that. This ends my memories of our travels in France, and it's a combination of more than one trip.